So now that we've talked about the various issues with measuring public opinion, how is public opinion formed in the first place? Well, generally speaking, in the literature, there are five uh, five primary sources of public opinion in terms of how public opinion is formed. First is genetics, socialization, then group attachments, social networks, and then finally exogenous events. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here in the next few minutes. So the first is genetics. Now, biopolitics is one of the burgeoning fields in political science right now, whether or not there are biological sources or origins of political opinions and attitudes. A lot of even biopolitical researchers are somewhat skeptical about making any sort of direct connection between genetics and political attitudes. At best, there might be some tangential or predispositional qualities that might come with certain characteristics that feed into partisanship, but I'd be very wary about taking too much about genetics to heart, but it is a growing field of study in political science, so I think it warrants discussion. So genetics are argued to have some connection to personality, primarily big five personality traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, when I say that genetics can have a predispositional effect towards political attitudes, I don't mean that if your genes look a certain way, you're going to be a Republican, regardless. You have no free will. Or Democrat. I don't mean to say that if you come from a long genetic line of Republicans, you're going to be a Republican, and so forth. But rather, the way this theory goes is that if, for example, you have higher degrees of openness due to some genetic predisposition, that might make you more willing to experience different things, more likely to get along with a wider variety of people, that you don't possess an aversion to things like change, or there's this idea that people who possess, this characteristic of openness might be more willing to see the world in terms of a spectrum or variation as opposed to black and white. And so this might lead them to certain personality characteristics that make them more liberal, more open, and consequently perhaps more likely to become democratic. That's not to say that there aren't people who possess high levels of openness that aren't Republicans. Or that are Republicans, I should say. I'm not saying that at all, and people who study biopolitics wouldn't think to say that. It's simply to say that there are certain genetic predispositions to certain personality traits that might make one more likely to have one political attitude over another. And that's all theories of genetic predispositions to political attitudes say, or even can say with any sort of legitimacy. And how does this occur? Well, there is this notion of selective mating. They say opposites attract, and that's fine and dandy in fiction. But from a social science perspective, what we observe in reality isn't opposites attract, it's birds of a feather, right? If you're a Democrat or you're a liberal, you're more likely to date or marry someone who is a Democrat or liberal. If you're conservative or Republican, you're more likely to marry someone or to date someone who is also a conservative or a Republican. That might lead you to have children who share some of these same characteristics that might make them more likely to be Republican. These things are also, I should say, when I'm speaking in these terms, are leading or predispositions to a certain ideology, not partisan affiliation, but ideology, more liberal to conservative. And ideologies make you more predisposed to join certain political parties. I think it's worth clarifying that uh, there is a link between genetics and these political attitudes and political partisanship, but it's somewhat convoluted and often mitigated by other factors. Still, it is a notion that's out there, and I thought that it was worth discussing. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, there are other things that I personally think have more of an effect on political and public attitudes. Socialization is one of them. So I don't necessarily put too much stock in this idea that genetic predispositions in and of themselves make you more likely to have attitudes one way or the other. But if you are raised and nurtured in a certain environment and your parents pass on certain values to you, that may very well serve as the origin for your political attitudes. This reinforcement of certain values and behaviors when you're raised would, or as the theory goes, will form certain attitudes within you that you then translate into public attitudes and partisan leanings. And this imitation and emulation of those characteristics and behaviors that you learn from your parents perpetuate themselves on into your children, and so on and so forth. Group attachments. As I suggested in my lecture on race and ethnicity, a lot of people not only identify as individuals, but as part of a larger group. And if you feel that a lot of your fortunes, a lot of your destiny is attached to how society views your group, you might look to your group for heuristics, for cues on how to feel about certain political topics. So, for example, if you're a certain race or ethnic group, that might heavily influence your attitude on certain issues. Your partisanship is a pretty obvious one, but your geography. If you live in the South and you identify as a Southerner, that might inform your political attitudes in a certain way, perhaps more so than if you were from the West or from the Midwest. Your class and socioeconomic status, your religion, and your profession might also have larger effects on your political attitudes. And to just demonstrate my point on this, look at this chart looking at the percentages of people that favor the death penalty. White people largely in favor of the death penalty. African Americans, majority in favor, but not by much, and certainly not compared to whites. When you look at partisanship, again, there is a clear disparity between those who favor and those who oppose. Both have a majority in favor, but the numbers much lower in favor on the Democratic side. And even geography, which you might not expect, seems to have an effect on your attitude towards the death penalty. It's not as great as race or partisanship, but there does seem to be a small effect. There could be many reasons for this. African Americans are disproportionately represented in death penalty cases, so that might play into attitudes towards the death penalty or perhaps even criminal justice overall. Social networks, who your friends are, who you talk to. We take a lot of our cues from the people we know. If our friends like something, that might make us like something. If they don't like something, we might not like it. You as college students might be heavily influenced not only by your family, but by your fellow classmates. What are you hearing in your classes, in your dorm rooms, dining halls? Now, how is that influencing your attitudes? It can also be through their various social media accounts. What are your friends posting to their Twitter feed? What are they posting to their Facebook accounts? That might lead you to certain articles, news, all of which might feed into certain biases that form or have a role in forming your opinions on political issues. Finally, exogenous events. These are things that people really have no control over. A depression, a natural disaster, a pandemic can have dramatic impact on people's political attitudes. So the coronavirus pandemic has greatly shifted the discourse on the social safety net, with unemployment looking like it's going to reach in the 20% number, perhaps over 20%, with people who aren't necessarily used to relying on government assistance, needing government assistance, many for the first time in their lives. Events like these do sometimes lead to a paradigm shift in public attitudes. People who traditionally were either indifferent or perhaps even hostile towards a social safety net might find themselves relying on it. The same thing occurred, or a similar incident occurred during the Great Depression of 1929, which resulted in a massive expansion of the American social safety net. And this chart I have here, you can see that there is an apparent shift in public opinion with regard to same-sex marriage shown in this chart. It starts to shift around 2011, and then the divergence into the opposite direction, it becomes really apparent in 2012, 2013. For those of you who may not have been politically cognizant, President Barack Obama, during the 2012 election, became the first national office holder to say that he supports same-sex marriage. And this may have had an effect on the public opinion on the matter. As I said, there is this question as to whether or not public opinion leads or follows. And this is one example where many argue that public opinion followed. People saw more national leaders embracing the idea, and it became more mainstreamed. And consequently, people sort of adopted the view as their own. So, in a nutshell, what is public opinion? A collection of attitudes, opinions, and preferences of the general public. Can it be measured accurately? Yes, but with a lot of caveats and a lot of concerns with regard to question wording, how you prime respondents, how you frame issues. What are the ways in which public opinion forms? Well, a lot of it has to do with characteristics that politicians and policymakers can't actually change, such as genetics, social attachments, socialization and group attachments, and events, large-scale events. The question that I want to put to you now is, knowing how public opinion can be formed, how public opinion is measured, and the issues with measurement, should public opinion be consulted? If the majority of the American public feel a certain way about an issue, should policymakers take note? Should they follow public opinion? If they're trying to come to terms with making decisions on an issue like gun control, which most Americans are in favor of some form of gun control, whether it be background checks or an outright ban on certain types of weapons, most people are in favor of regulation of some kinds, albeit different kinds. Yet the government really hasn't done anything with regard to gun control. Now, some of you may feel that they should, but keep in mind that that chart I just showed you showed that an overwhelming majority of people were in favor of were not in favor of same-sex marriage for a good period of time. And over time, as the issue became more mainstream, public opinion shifted. And now same-sex marriage is the law of the land. Surveys in the 1950s and 60s era South and the country overall that looked at race relations, very wary of the idea of integration. That mean that integration was wrong because the public was against it. So there are issues in which public opinion might be behind the times, but there are also issues in which public opinion, you might feel, should be heeded. And mostly people's attitudes as to whether or not public opinion should be followed by policymakers, it often determines by the issue. And policymakers deal with this as well. They have to play this balancing act as to when to follow public opinion and when not to follow it. Perhaps they feel that the public is misinformed or uninformed on the issue. Either way, public opinion and the role it plays in a democracy, however convoluted and however confusing at times, isn't going anywhere. News and news media outlets will frequently fill the airwaves with various interpretations or spiels about what the newest poll means for the presidential election. But like I said, polls are snapshots in time, subject to change, and can do so very quickly. So with that being said, that does it for public opinion. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me.